Peter Credlin, live on Sky News Australia.
Good evening, welcome to the show. Great to have your company to kick off a new week. It's a sitting week in Canberra, very interesting. Let's go there now. Here's what's coming up on the show tonight. A shocker of a Newspoll for Labor today. The worst result, not just since the election, but in over a decade. The two major parties now are neck and neck with this poll. And it comes at a time where the PM's seen to be increasingly out of touch and his government to be less than competent. Good news out of New South Wales Supreme Court today. Two Indigenous siblings allowed to be adopted by their long-term white foster parents. But wait until you understand the policy madness that's held up this common sense result, because it's more about Indigenous activism than I would see the best interests of the child. Legal expert Chris Merritt with more. Plus, fresh criticism of the education curriculum, with experts concluding that teachers are having to make it up as they go along. This, of course, comes at the same time Victorian teachers are being asked to take this week, so a whole week, to support Palestine. And the Albanese government again on the back foot over the release of foreign criminals from detention, with revelations late this afternoon that the government had been trying since September to get US State Department help to resettle the same child sex criminal who triggered the whole court case in the beginning. It makes a mockery of the minister's claim her department told her that they would win in the High Court.
Minister Giles, why did you concede on the 30th of May it was not possible to deport NZYQ before approaching other countries to take him? And how does that square with Minister O'Neill's claim that operational advice said that it was likely that you would be able to deport him?
Well, I'm not going to comment on the handling of litigation in the High Court.
Well, it's run and done, and this is actually about an operational matter about why efforts weren't taken to deport him until after you conceded that central fact.
So,
it's not,
Paul, can I say, you've had on the record comments. Neither of us is planning to add further to them. Phil, this is the last question.
It was like dumb and dumber today in that press conference. I'll get to that in a moment. But first, as today's Newspoll shows, there's now a real chance that Anthony Albanese could lead a one-term government. Now, sure, the conventional wisdom is that governments always get a second term. And yes, it's almost 100 years since the Scullin government was thrown out after just one term during the Great Depression. But the electorate is a lot more volatile than in Scullin's day. And Labor too is different, increasingly in the thrall of the hard green left. There's also a sense in the community the country's headed in the wrong direction, that ministers are not up to the job, and that this is a government, more often than not, making a bad situation worse. Hence the Newspoll result that for the first time this term, the government and the opposition are level pegging at 50-50 in two-party preferred terms. Now, in primary vote terms, that's 38 points to the coalition, they're up 1, and 31 points, just 31% to Labor, who are down 4. And it's the primary vote that I track more than anything. Now, a lot of other commentators have said today this is the worst primary vote result for Labor since the election. But actually, it's their worst Newspoll result in a decade, since October 2013. It's even worse than the Turnbull and Morrison low ebbs, which says a lot, doesn't it? It does not mean an imminent challenge to the Prime Minister. No, it doesn't. That's now much harder on both sides than it was in the Rudd, Gillard, Abbott, Turnbull era, given all the rule changes. But it's worth noting that this Newspoll, in Rudd's time, 52-48, said then to be a shocker. Well, that was a Newspoll that Julia Gillard used to roll Kevin Rudd. Labor's primary vote back then too was 35%, compared today to just 31%. Now, Labor optimists will say they've got 18 months to go, that this is just mid-term blues that nearly every government suffers. But to believe that would be a mistake, because a government that was elected without any real mandate or clear program, this government, perhaps other than the Voice, which has failed, and cutting power bills, which hasn't happened at all, doesn't get the usual goodwill or benefit of the doubt. As well, it's hard to see how the government can readily recover, given that it's doubling down on the energy madness that even climate-caring corporates are now admitting is driving us off a cliff. It's doubling down too on union-dictated workplace relations changes to get a win in the parliament, even though these will further depress a national productivity performance that must lift. It has no answer either to out-of-control legal immigration, even though record numbers of newcomers are pushing wages up, pushing wages down, driving housing costs up and clogging infrastructure. And as we've seen in recent weeks, it's looking very shaky, both on national security grounds, where the PM couldn't bring himself to tell Australians whether he stood up for our sailors with the Chinese president or not, and on border security, where we've just had illegal arrivals from Java turn up on the Australian mainland for the first time in almost a decade. What's more, it's hard to see any good news coming for the government. To every problem, its only response is extra spending, or a review, or hand-wringing. The last best example is a green energy announcement from Chris Bowen last week to spend billions more on renewables in a plan that is uncosted, a plan he refuses to tell taxpayers how much of their money he'll spend, and a plan that's been already mocked by industry experts. But it's Bowen, the bloke with the worst record on border protection, so why would anyone expect better? However, before Peter Dutton's team get too cocky and complacent about their chances, they need to remember the next coalition government needs to be so much better than where the last one ended up. And that means, yes, it's got to take the fight up to Labor every day, but it also needs to do the policy work needed to fix the mess if and when it gets elected. Look, and speaking of spending money in response to every problem, Labor's now trying to buy its way out of the problem with foreign criminals released into the community after the High Court's ruling a fortnight back. Today's joint announcement by Home Affairs Minister Claire O'Neill and her offsider, the Immigration Minister Andrew Giles, and two uniformed officers, the heads of the AFP and Border Force today, was meant to make the government look tough and in control. Now, in reality, it just emphasised how the government's been scrambling to respond to a crisis it should have anticipated and dealt with in advance. As my colleague Andrew Clennell reported today, here's Minister O'Neill making excuses for the government on the 19th of November.
You knew this could happen in June, though, didn't you, or did you?
We knew that there was a High Court action on foot. We knew that it was 20 years of legal precedent, and we were advised that it was likely that the Commonwealth would win the case, that is, allow us to do what we wanted to do, which is keep these people in detention.
Minister, who advised you were likely to win, and how recently did you receive that advice?
Well, we received that advice from the Department of Home Affairs, who tell us what chances we have of success and failure in each legal case. But I do need you to understand that
when did you receive that advice?
I do need you to understand that our department is one of the most litigated against departments of the Commonwealth.
But as Clennell revealed today, well before the minister claimed the government thought it would win the case, there was actually a flurry of secret emails between our officials and officials in the United States using the Prime Minister's official visit as leverage, showing how desperate the government was to get the foreign criminal. This is the one who was the subject of the original High Court action. This is the child rapist, relegated to a third country. So there'd be nothing then to adjudicate in front of the High Court, and the government could avoid an adverse judgment. Clennell reported one Home Affairs email, and I quote, "The Minister views this case of the utmost importance and wishes all avenues, including difficult ones, progressed. I think a further discussion is warranted on an approach to Bangladesh and third country options for engagement." Now, the kindest thing that can be said about Minister O'Neill is that she's been far from straight here with the Australian people. The bottom line is, though, that the government did know this was a problem coming down at them like a freight train and failed to do what they should have done, namely draft in advance legislation to keep foreign criminals in immigration detention, or better yet, throw them out of the country. instead of the belated after the event, only because the opposition forced them into doing it, option of mandatory reporting and ankle bracelets. But with criminals still out on the streets despite that legislation now 10 days ago. So the taxpayer is now on the hook twice. First, because Australians have been put at greater risk of crime, and second, because just to reduce this risk, an extra $255 million will now be spent, or about $1 million per foreign criminal. Doesn't even include all the welfare and the housing support and all of that, because this is a government and a minister that were asleep at the wheel. Compounding this ongoing shambles is the sneakiness of announcing just moments after O'Neill left that media conference today that the stood-down Home Affairs boss, Mike Pezzullo, has now been sacked by the Albanese government. Because what happened here was that O'Neill, the Home Affairs Minister, wrapped up her press conference, scampered out of the room, and then puts out the media release that the Home Affairs Secretary was sacked. Now, if she was a minister worthy of the name, she would have released that information in the room at the press conference and taken questions on it. That she wasn't able to do that, couldn't do that, amplifies her lack of horsepower and indeed her courage. I don't think she's up for the job. I don't think Australians think she's up for the job, nor is Andrew Giles. And it's about as gutless as the way this government operates generally. We've got the issue of the Prime Minister. We have those Australian naval personnel injured by a Chinese warship on the Tuesday. The government keeps quiet about it. The Prime Minister goes to APEC, meets with President Xi, and then only when he's on the plane on the way home do we find out about what happened to our naval divers. Now, Mike Pezzullo might have been indiscreet, texting power brokers outside of the government, but I bet many of the recent mistakes might have been avoided if this tough on borders bureaucrat had still been at his post. All right, let's go to Canberra now for the headlines. We're joined now by our Sky News senior political reporter, Trudy McIntosh.
Good evening. More detainees could be released from immigration detention as the High Court prepares to hand down its full reasons tomorrow during question time. Today, the government revealed another 45 detainees have been released into the community, while the majority of the more than 138 people are complying with strict surveillance measures. One is missing, and at least 4 have refused to wear electronic bracelets.
All I'll say is that they're at the lower end of risk to the community, those 4. In one case that's been referred to the Australian Federal Police, we're still making attempts to contact that person.
Border Force and Federal Police have been given a $255 million boost to help with the 24/7 monitoring effort. That's around $1.8 million per released detainee.
These are some of the hardest hardened criminals that you could ever get.
We will continue to leave no stone unturned when it comes to ensuring the safety of the Australian community.
More could be freed imminently when the High Court publishes its full reasons for its decision on Tuesday.
It's possible that no further criteria will be set down by the High Court. It is possible that other cohorts will be brought in.
The government is also scrambling to deal with the fallout of a second separate High Court ruling. New changes will be made to ensure courts, not ministers, will have the power to strip the dual citizenship of convicted terrorists. And it goes further, adding people convicted of foreign interference and espionage. Mike Pezzullo has been sacked as Home Affairs Secretary after a scathing review into his conduct. The report found the long-serving bureaucrat breached the Public Service Code of Conduct on at least 14 occasions, including by disrespecting ministers, failing to maintain confidentiality and failing to act apolitically. It follows an 8-week review of his leaked text messages with a Liberal power broker. Trudy McIntosh, Sky News, Canberra.
Lots to get through today. Joining me now, the Australian's national editor, as he does on a Monday, Dennis Shanahan. Well, thank you for your time. I'll get stuck into Newspoll in a moment, but I have to go to that issue today with Home Affairs Minister Claire O'Neill, trying to explain away why they were asleep at the wheel, because she said she was advised by her department that they would likely win the High Court case. So no need, Dennis, for a plan B. That's at odds with those secret emails released by Andrew Credlin late this afternoon that show her department back in September, so well and truly before she made those comments, talking to the US government about how they could resettle the bloke that instigated that High Court challenge, the child sex abuser. This issue isn't going away, and I think it's one of those things, Dennis, and you know, particular things cut through like nothing else. This is one of those things that voters have picked up on, and they're pretty angry about it.
There's no doubt about that. It has cut right through. It's the number of criminals who have been released. But more than that, it's the lack of competence shown by the government, the lack of anticipation. Even if a department had given them advice that they were going to win the High Court, a prudent minister will say, well, let's just have a look here and see what we can do if we do lose. I remember Malcolm Turnbull telling the Parliament how the High Court would find. He said, they will find. No, they didn't. And he was completely caught short. This has happened to Julia Gillard, I've mentioned before. The Malaysian people swap failed. So what we actually have is a normal ministerial duty to prepare for the likelihood of a High Court decision going against, as Claire O'Neill says, the most litigated department in the entire government. And yet they didn't. But worse than that, what they were doing was also trying to head off the High Court decision. And why would you be doing that if you didn't think you might lose? And that heading it off was to expel the person who was the sex offender, get him sent off to Bangladesh or Saudi Arabia, get the US to take him, New Zealand, wherever they could get rid of him, they wanted to, because they knew that this could open up literally Pandora's box on all of these detention, people in detention. And tomorrow we may see with the reasons the rest of the 340 also being released, all because of a lack of anticipation. Yes, you needed the full reasons, and I think the High Court was very slack in not providing its reasons immediately on such a serious issue. But you still need the reasons to make final legislation. You don't need it to make some sort of precautionary legislation, as we saw 10 days ago when within 12 hours the government passed the legislation because the coalition supported it. This has been a failure of government, a failure of governance and a failure of ministerial responsibility.
I was one of the first to say a big problem for the Voice campaign on the yes side was Linda Burney. I said Linda Burney is like an albatross. She's not an advocate on this issue. She's a real problem. Of course, they couldn't do anything about her. I suspect they will when a reshuffle comes at Christmas time. I think if Claire O'Neill stays in this job, they will never recover on this issue of broader protection. So we'll see what happens over Christmas. Let's go to that Newspoll. 31% primary vote. It's a shocker. Worst for Labor in a decade. For the coalition, they've had a 4-point gain. Their primary's now at 38. You like it to have a 4 in front if you're the coalition, because Labor can combine their primary vote, of course, with the Greens. In 2 PP terms, they're 50-50, neck and neck. What does this tell you, Dennis Shanahan?
Well, it tells me that Labor's in a great deal of trouble and that the public have woken up to it. There's a question of competence. There is obviously a failure as far as the appeal for Anthony Albanese is concerned. I think the failure of the Indigenous referendum was clearly the beginning of this, but we've seen since then crisis after crisis, event after event mishandled by the government. And now what we are seeing is that disapproval rating with Anthony Albanese, which has been there for a while, now bleeding into the government big time. This is a terrible time for the government to go into the summer break on its lowest primary vote in a decade. And I simply, 50-50 on two-party preferred, well, that's a calculation. It's based on all sorts of things. And we know that Anthony Albanese just scraped in at the last election with a 1-seat majority on a primary vote bigger than this. So it really has shaken the Labor Party, because people for some time have been saying there is a real prospect of a minority government. There is still time, there's plenty of time, but so far, no sign the government has woken up to the fact it needs to do something, it needs to perform better, and leaves open the prospect of a one-term government, a minority government at best.
Let's go to something else I picked up this afternoon. It's a real worry. A Labor-controlled parliamentary committee has recommended that the ACT and the Northern Territory get 2 extra senators. So currently they've got 2. They'd go to 4 each, which would in effect, as I read it, give Labor considerable upper house power. Power, of course, in government, yes, you'd assume the swing's on, they get the numbers in the upper house. But given the way the ACT and the NT tend to fall out, I think it would give them huge power in opposition as well, effectively giving them some sort of workable majority, whether they're in power or not. What's your take here? And the other point is I think the government will move on this, Dennis. What do you think?
Yes, well, I think the committee also suggests that they look at a proposal to expand the House of Representatives to 175 or 200 MPs to ensure that we're on level with pegging with the UK as far as proportional representation is concerned. That's not going to happen. I think the government will be very keen to increase the number of senators in the ACT and the Northern Territory, double it from 2 to 4 in each, because what that will necessarily do in the ACT is, over the years, ensure a progressive count in the ACT of 3 to 1. It may even be 4 if you have a Green or 2 independents and 2 Labor. This is a foundation stone for a long-term, never-ending, progressive stranglehold on the Senate. If you can count on 3 votes, 3 solid votes out of the ACT and 2 out of the Northern Territory, you have a 5-member Senate base that you can then come down to when it comes to balance of power in the Senate. It basically means the Conservative side of politics could be frozen out of the Senate forever. I think the government will be keen to do this. I don't think they'll worry about expanding the number of MPs to 200. They'll just say, oh, no, we don't need that, and increase the number of senators in the Senate. It is too tempting for Labor not to do it. Mind you, they don't have a mandate. They didn't do any of this before the last election, and putting in more politicians is never a popular idea.
The rat cunning, though, Dennis, the coalition in 2013 had a mandate to get rid of a carbon tax, and the Labor Party in the upper house did not respect that mandate. So I think it'll be too tempting. I certainly think they'll do it. Let's see what happens. Dennis Shanahan, thank you. All right, let's go back to that issue, the one that broke late this afternoon, revealed, of course, by my colleagues, Sky political editor Andrew Clennell, that the Albanese government was desperately lobbying the US State Department to settle the child sex criminal, rapist of a child, the detainee, NZYQ, in the US, while the Prime Minister was in the DC. Now, this was a few weeks, of course, before the High Court made its final decision to release what we now know to be 141, that's the latest count of today, detainees, many of whom are convicted murderers, pedophiles and rapists, onto the streets of Australia. The real headline here, however, is that these revelations contradict Labor's claims that it was caught flat-footed by the High Court's decision, an excuse they've used, as you know, to justify their failure to keep these criminals detained. Joining me now to discuss this, Shadow Minister for Home Affairs, Senator James Paterson. Well, clearly, James, they might have said they were blindsided by the High Court decision. They look like they were very flat-footed, but these emails now show they were looking at options to get this child rapist out of the country back in September. Of course, the US refused, no surprises here. But the government should have been better prepared. They weren't, and now these detainees are out in the community and they can't even tell us who is being monitored and who is not, can they?
Peter, I know this is going to be hard for you and your viewers to believe, but actually the government's handling of this got even more shambolic today than it already was last week. One is that breaking news story from Andrew Clennell this afternoon, which clearly demonstrated that the government was in grave fear that it was going to lose its case and was trying to do everything it could to get this applicant out of the country, which contradicts what Claire O'Neill told Andrew Clennell on his program a few weeks ago, that the government was confident that it was going to win the case and therefore it didn't need to prepare for it. But secondly, the government yesterday night wrote to the opposition to tell us that today they would need to introduce two urgent bills on these matters. One was on citizenship cessation and the other was cleaning up.
Welcome back. Sorry for that. We've lost all communications with Canberra, though we have managed to get him back now. Senator James Patterson, Shadow Minister for Home Affairs, is still with us now. James, you were just outlining, I thought it was pretty bad up until this afternoon and those revelations from Andrew Clennell, but you say it's actually worse than you think. Peter, tell us more.
That's right, Peter. So yesterday afternoon, the government contacted us to tell us that they had two urgent bills that they wanted to brief us on this morning at 7:45am. And in that briefing, they told us that these two bills must pass the Parliament today. One of them was to clean up drafting errors that they had identified in their own legislation, which passed the Parliament only a week ago. And the other was to deal with this citizen cessation law, which the High Court had ruled partially invalid. Now, they gave us an ultimatum. They weren't able to answer basic questions. They didn't even provide us all the relevant documentation at 8am this morning and told us, basically put a gun to our head and said these bills must pass. And yet this afternoon, they've now admitted actually maybe these bills don't need to pass today. Maybe they can be put on pause. And we are going to get the High Court's reasons tomorrow afternoon. So perhaps we should wait until we have the benefit of that. I mean, it really is utterly shambolic here in Canberra. This government has no idea what it is doing when it comes to national security and border protection. And the community is in danger as a result, because we have at least 141 people who are in the community, not all of whom are being electronically monitored, contrary to their commitment to do so.
What surprises me, and I have to say I agree with you there, I've not heard of anyone running a process like this, as shambolic as this. But what surprises me, you're talking there about, I presume, the dual citizenship provision that was put in place by the former government, knocked out again by the High Court. We've seen, in fact, one convicted Islamic terrorist, Ben Breaker, regain his Australian citizenship after it was taken off him by, I think at the time, Peter Dutton. Is this what the legislation is supposed to fix or remediate?
Exactly, Peter. But one of the concerns we have with the draft legislation that we've seen today, which the government is proposing should not go to a parliamentary committee inquiry, should not be examined at all, should just be passed, is that it in fact doesn't deal with any historical cases like Ben Breaker and others. It doesn't have any retrospective elements to it. It will only now deal with future terrorism cases. So Ben Breaker, who's had his citizenship restored, will remain an Australian citizen. And that means a whole lot of options are taken off the table to deal with people like that. For example, you can't deport him because he's
Hang on.
So we're really concerned.
James, sorry to jump in there, but I mean, for people at home to understand is he is one of the worst of the worst. So if and when he comes out of jail, he will be an Australian citizen. He will be able to come and go, perhaps go overseas into countries that we would be very concerned about him visiting again, and then return to Australia. Why can't he be dealt with under this legislation? And if it doesn't allow Ben Breaker to be dealt with, why can't they fix it up now and get it right?
Really good questions, Peter, all of which we asked this morning, none of which we got good answers to. And frankly, we're not prepared to rush through legislation that doesn't even deal with our most serious ever convicted terrorist offender in Ben Breaker, who will wander around the streets as an Australian citizen under the government's proposal. We want them to go back to the drawing board, have a look at this again, see whether cases like his can actually be dealt with, whether or not it can apply retrospectively, because this person had his Australian citizenship taken away from him for good reason. He violated the principles of Australian citizenship. He has citizenship of another country. It should be taken off him. And the government's unwillingness to explore all possible options to ensure that's the case reflects very badly on their commitment to protect the community.
And the courts have also said in evidence that there's absolutely no evidence that this guy has been rehabilitated in any way. Without going into the ins and outs of the removal today of Mike Pezzullo, who was the former head, now the Secretary of Home Affairs, stood aside. What I thought was extraordinary, the Minister and her offside of the Immigration Minister, Home Affairs Minister, Immigration Minister, front that press conference this morning, and then afterwards, after she's left the room, the government squeaks out a press release saying that Pezzullo is being sacked. Now, the ordinary course of events would be that press release goes out, she turns up at a press conference, she takes questions from the media. I just thought this was cowardice, absolute cowardice today. James, what did you think?
That's right, Peter. This is another example of the government's incredibly cynical media management strategy. They did it when the Prime Minister was leaving San Francisco, when they only released after his press conference and he got on the plane that the PLAN had been attacking Australian Navy soldiers in the Indo-Pacific, and they've done it again here. In fact, Claire O'Neill was even asked about this issue at the press conference, and she pretended not to know anything about it and said it's a matter for the Prime Minister. Well, either the Minister for Home Affairs didn't know that the Prime Minister was about to sack the Home Affairs Secretary, or she deliberately misled the Parliamentary Press Gallery here in Canberra. And I think it says something that even the Press Gallery, who's been pretty soft on this government so far, is now starting to get really frustrated with their cynical media management and hold them to account much better, as they always should have been.
James Patterson, thank you. Look, I'll just say something in relation to Mike Pezzullo's defence. He worked for the Labor Party. He was no patsy of the Liberal Party. But in my time in the Howard government, when we were trying to stop the boats and all the bureaucrats sat around the table and told you why you couldn't do it and why it was too hard, he was someone who always spoke up and said, Prime Minister, if that's your mandate and that's what you want to get done, I will get it done. And we stopped the boats. Funny, he's been stood aside and then started up again. All right, let's go to that good news of a sort out of the New South Wales Supreme Court, that ruling today that two siblings can be adopted by their long-term foster parents. This comes after their Indigenous mother voiced concerns that the foster family wouldn't understand Aboriginal culture. She couldn't look after them, but she wasn't happy with the people that were, wasn't happy at least enough to allow them to be adopted. Now, for some context, the foster parents raised the two children since they were babies. The eldest sibling has said to the courts she wanted to stay with the foster parents because, and I quote, they keep us safe and feed us healthy food. Their Indigenous heritage was actually only discovered 3 years ago in 2020 when a bureaucrat found records revealing the whereabouts of the child's mother, who now identifies as an Aboriginal woman. And her linkages go back, they say, until the 1850s. This meant the kids then fell under the Aboriginal child placement principle, which requires as a first preference that they be adopted by a member of the Aboriginal community, if not the immediate family of the mother or the father, but the broader community. Joining me now to discuss this, legal affairs contributor at The Australian, Chris Merritt. Chris, I really care about this issue because I thought the law, particularly in relation to children, was that the best interest of the child would prevail. The foster parents, OK, they're not Aboriginal, don't identify as Aboriginal, but they have raised these children since they were just months old. The children want to be adopted and have the permanence of mum and dad from the foster parents, soon to be now adopted parents. But the impediment has always been both the relinquishing mother, the Aboriginal woman, but also this principle or this idea now in policy terms that you can't really adopt an Aboriginal child if you're not Aboriginal.
Well, on the face of it, that seems to be the preferred intention of the statute. This is the Adoption Act of New South Wales. But if you dig into this judgment, and not just one judgment, there's been a few of them on this matter, it shows that that principle of the best interests of the child actually prevails. And in rule of law terms, that's perfect, because the principle that we're all equal and we should all be treated equally regardless of race is fundamental. But when you look at what had to happen in this case, for these kids to be adopted and get the surname of their adoptive parents, it's extraordinary. They had the parents and the kids had to jump through all sorts of hoops. The parents had to show that they had the capacity to understand Indigenous culture and impart Indigenous culture on these children. The kids go to Aboriginal cultural classes. The parents have gone to cultural awareness classes. The interesting thing is that this application was actually brought before the court by the New South Wales Department of Communities and Justice, i.e. the government. The government thought it was in the best interests of the children that they be adopted by their non-Indigenous foster parents. They're parents who have been looking after them since before they could speak. The fact that the Indigenous mother didn't know or didn't wish to identify initially as Indigenous is also a relevant point when you consider that she subsequently argued against the adoption on the grounds that these adoptive parents wouldn't be able to impart Indigenous culture. Well, the judge found that that's not the case, that these parents have actually ticked all the boxes and jumped through the hoops that have been set there in the statute. The statute applied. The best interests of the child have prevailed, and they've been adopted and given the surname of their adoptive parents for 7 years. And who could expect anything else? It makes common sense.
This is something too that Jacinta Nampijinpa-Price has long been campaigning for. She says that laws like this hinder children being able to readily be adopted into families in a permanent way that are basically raising them anyway, because, and we see this time and time again, where they can stay with a foster parent, but they don't ever get the surname and the permanence of adoption because of this Aboriginal question.
Look, it does limit the options for kids like this. All kids deserve to have as many options as possible when it comes to their future, just like these kids did.
Oh, Chris Merritt, thank you very much. Thank you for that update. We'll stay across that issue. I think it's incredibly important. After the break, this expert report saying our education system's too vague, too broad, and poorly trained teachers are just making it up as they go along. Plus, teachers in Victoria too encouraged this week to be Palestinian activists in the classroom. And climate protesters blocking the port of Newcastle over the weekend. They've cost us $100 million worth of exports. After the break. Welcome back. And now to another report cataloguing the failures in our education system. And it isn't a lack of money that's the problem. It's how we train teachers and what those teachers teach and how they teach. That's the focus of this new damning report from the Australian Education Research Organisation. The organisation warns in their report that the new curriculum does not provide sufficient guidance to teachers, many of whom they say are now being required to invent their own syllabus resources. It also found that compared to 7 comparable countries, Australia has half the content of other education systems and omits or includes only a low level of some essential topics and teaches other content years later than kids get it in other school jurisdictions. Joining me now to discuss this, Senior Fellow at the Australian Catholic University, Dr. Kevin Donnelly. Well, Kevin, you've made a lifetime of studying national curricula, making sure not just that teachers know how to teach, but that what we're teaching kids is relevant, ahead of the world, OECD level. We've got some real issues here with the curriculum. Science in particular is a top concern. Take us through what the report finds today.
Thank you, Peter, and you're correct. It's a very good report today, and I congratulated those people responsible. But we've known about this issue for over 25 years. There have been various benchmarking reports I've been involved in that really tell us that Australia, if you like, the rot set in all those years ago. So when you look internationally, those countries that outperform us in the international testing, they adopt a more academically rigorous curriculum. They don't try and do as much as we do, so our curriculum is overcrowded. They focus overseas, places like, if you think of the usual suspects, Japan, Singapore, South Korea, Hong Kong, but also if you look at Quebec in Canada and even New Zealand now and England, who are outperforming us, they focus on the essential knowledge, understanding and skills. It's not superficial, whereas the Australian curriculum is overcrowded, and that makes it almost impossible to teach. Teachers really have their hands tied here because the curriculum promotes a checklist mentality and they don't have the time. They're trying to cover too much. They can't focus on what's essential.
Yeah, and what they're covering is the stuff of no great value. It's not the building block basics that kids need to learn. And interesting, the report says, this is in relation to science, that in the first 9 years of a child's education in Australia, we only cover 44 science-related topics, international topics, but overseas they cover an average of 74. So basically double what we do. Now, you're right to say the curriculum's crowded, but it must be crowded with crap because all the stuff we should be teaching, we're not.
You're right about that. And I mean, as you know, I reviewed the national curriculum in 2016. And when you look at the way Australia's done it, we don't just, like a syllabus, list what the content is. We also have these cross-curricular priorities, sustainability, Indigenous, study of Asia. It's all very woke, all very politically correct. And we also have these so-called general competencies, working in teams, being creative. It's all very new age, all about 21st century learning. So the curriculum, it's contradictory in a way. We try and do too much with all the competencies and priorities and then the content. But in doing all of that, we're missing out on what's essential. What if you talk about particular disciplines like mathematics, like science, like English, music, whatever it might be, we're not teaching the essential content early enough. And the overseas countries, they tend to do more difficult work earlier, whereas we leave it till later and it's often too late.
Just quickly on Palestinian activism in schools. We saw obviously the predominantly Victorian kids, but it went around the country protesting last week in pro-Palestinian marches. We see today there's a flyer that's come out from the Australian Education Union, Victoria branch, no surprises there, wanting teachers all week to wear a traditional Palestinian headscarf or a pro-Palestinian badge or T-shirt. Activism all week in the classroom. What do you think, Kevin?
Well, again, it's not surprising. You might remember during the Howard years, the Australian Education Union came out and told students to strike because America and Australia had gone into Iraq after the Twin Towers were destroyed. The AEU, they're cultural left, cultural Marxist, if you like. They have a long history of promoting what I call indoctrination in schools for young, vulnerable students. So they scare students about climate change, the world's about to end. They tell boys that they're guilty of toxic masculinity. This whole push over the last week is simply the latest example. And it just proves to me in education that Dracula's in charge of the blood bank.
Kevin Donnelly, thank you for your time. Let's go now to my panel. We'll start, though, with the issue of energy, because last week, you may recall I spoke to an energy market analyst, Saul Kavonic. We were discussing Chris Bowen's latest change to net zero policy and the energy transition agenda. After our show, Kavonic wrote that Labor is now well down the road towards a predominantly government-controlled and funded energy system. Now, government funding means taxpayer funding. He said the government's resorting to taxpayer money to bail it out of the energy market mess it's created. He also noted that the new policy is an admission by the government that they are worried about blackouts and trying to fix it. But without using the best solution, he says, which is gas, it's been ruled out because the government has to pander to the Greens. I might add too, this whole policy is uncosted. Joining me now to discuss this and more, a final panel for the night, former Resources Minister, Liberal National Party MP for the seat of Hinkler in Queensland, Keith Pitt, and Sky News host, Corey Bernardi. Well, I don't think there's much there that Saul Kavonic's got wrong, has he, Keith? I think he's nailed it.
Oh, Peter, Chris Bowen, Blackout Bowen, he's a bit of a miracle worker, this guy. So what he says is the cheapest form of energy production, which is intermittent wind and solar, is now so cheap that it needs an unknown bucket load of the Australian taxpayers' money, which is a secret, to get anyone to build it. He is going to guarantee returns to people like industry super funds and overseas investors to get this stuff built in Australia because no one will do it. So I think that says everything the Australian taxpayer should know. These processes shouldn't go ahead. It's intermittent, it's unreliable, it's not going to be the cheapest form, and no one is talking about the cost of transmission, which is around half of your power bill.
And the unpopularity of transmission once it rolls out to a paddock or a country town near you. That's the other thing that's biting them, particularly on the eastern seaboard. Corey, a Resolve poll out today says that less than 1 in 5 Australians oppose ending the prohibition on nuclear power in Australia, which means 4 out of 5 of us say, yeah, it's about time we end the ban. So will we see change?
I certainly hope so, but I think we might need to see a change of government, Peter. I mean, that 1 in 5 is the Greens voters and the hard left of the Labor Party, including Chris Bowen himself. This is just an extraordinary failure to allow Australia to consider options. I've always argued it should have happened during the coalition years, but now, with 4 out of 5 Australians thinking removing the ban is okay. It doesn't mean we're going to have nuclear power stations. It just means we can actually put forward feasibility studies, you can examine it, and you can see, is this going to work for our country? It works everywhere else in the world, so it would work here, but not under Chris Bowen.
No, because you're not going to get any corporate player or private sector player, public sector player, put their hand up to do anything in this space if there's a prohibition in the parliament. You've got to get rid of that and allow the market to at least put forward some bids. Talk to me about what happened in the port of Newcastle over the weekend, Keith, because someone said to me, I think it was 500,000 tonnes of coal could not get out. That's worth about $100 million. Is that accurate?
I think that's probably close, Peter. But this group should change their name to Plastic Lovers Australia. They're out protesting the petrochemical industry and their plastic kayaks. They've got their plastic paddles. The leader of the Greens is in his neoprene wetsuit. It's all made from petrochemical products. And what are they doing? They're stopping Australia's export industry, the biggest one in the country, that employs tens of thousands of people and continue to knock around our reputation. We've got the situation now where our long-standing trading partners and investors, Japan, think there's sovereign risk in this country. And what's the government doing? Well, the Labor government is giving money to the Environmental Defender's Office to support these types of activities and to take individual projects to the courts and knock them out. You can't have it both ways. They're either pro-resources or they're not.
No. Corey, we saw some reports over the weekend. I think this is the government reading the tea leaves, certainly in their internal polling, that we've reached peak migration. They're going to start to track it down. They're talking about putting caps and perhaps even taxing international students. We've seen those electoral results in the Netherlands. Indeed, we've seen them in Argentina, but I think the Netherlands relates specifically to the issue of illegal migration. We can see it really biting in the UK. Where do you see this issue going here in Australia?
Well, I think the government have read the tea leaves a little bit, but what we've got in Argentina, which is an economic issue, but also in the Netherlands, which was basically a cultural and a migration issue, we've got people recognising that what the mainstream media promotes, what the major political parties promote, what this orthodoxy about, cancelled culture of anyone with an alternative view, they've led us to a point where the West is very, very weak, where government decisions and policies are taking people backwards. And we know in this country, Peter, that the huge migration issues are propping up the GDP figures for the government to make the government look good, but they're making Australians go backwards from a per capita income. We're in a per capita recession. And what they call populism, or they say is far-right politics, unfortunately, it's just a backlash to the failures of politics. And it was identifiable, Peter. I went and did a study tour of migration in Europe. I met with Geert Wilders. I'm proud to call him a friend because he was far ahead of the curve. You cannot repair a cultural balance sheet as easy as you can an economic one. And we're heading for a disaster on both counts in this country.
All right, let's go to that. Stay with that issue, the issue of the Nazi salute, Keith. The coalition will move amendments to ban the Nazi salute this week. Now, it's unclear whether Labor's going to support your amendment. They indicated, I think, the last time the Parliament sit, they would not. Have you got an update?
Well, Peter, when was the last time that you would even imagined or thought for a second you'd have to convince the Labor Party to put this ban in place, particularly in the current circumstances? I just find it quite incredible that they're even resisting to start with. So I don't have a new update for you, mate, I'm sorry, but we'll be putting through the amendments that we think are right. And once again, I mean, Julian Leeser stood up in the Parliament today and spoke about a former member And here's someone who's at the heart of the challenges we're seeing in Sydney right now. And these are discussions I never thought I'd see in Australia. I really didn't.
Yeah, well, we'll watch that one closely. I agree with you, Keith Pitt. Thank you for your time, Corey Bernardi. Great to have you on the program. All right, that's it with me. Thanks for your company tonight. See you tomorrow night at 6. Here's Andrew Bolt.